If these arguments are plausible, why do you think it is that they're increasingly unpopular? Is it just that people have never dealt with these arguments, or they decide that they're not interested in hearing the arguments because it's more fun to be atheist than not to be atheist? Why is atheism gaining?
That's called thinking. Go with it.
Welcome back, everyone, to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're checking out a trio of videos from over at The Daily Wire, in which the hosts do their ample best to address the topic of atheism in a variety of different contexts. Now, we have a bunch to get into, so let's kick things off with the first video, in which novelist, conservative political commentator, and THX 1138 stand-in Andrew Klavan addresses atheism during one of his panels at a Young America's Foundation seminar. Let's see what he has for us.
Here is the moment we are at, okay? And it makes me very optimistic. Our atheist friends who are running the culture have ceased to make sense.
Okay, you have my attention. So what exactly is it that atheists are saying or promoting that doesn't make sense to you? Maybe I can clear it up.
That's what happens when you pull the bottom block out of the Jenga tower. It falls down, right?
Well, I can understand that analogy if you're using the falling Jenga tower to represent the atheist destroying the foundations of religious thinking by exposing how fallacious it is, thus resulting in the collapse of everything within that worldview that rests upon the concept of a god existing. But the only way this would be detrimental to the non-theistic worldview is if the non-theist were holding to the same claims, positions, and entailments that the theist does. Which we obviously don't, because there's no god in the non-theistic worldview, and thus anything entailed by that god's existence doesn't apply.
They are talking utter nonsense.
Okay, well, how about you point out something that you think is nonsense? It's possible, if you don't actually understand what atheism is and what it entails, that I may be able to clear up this apparent misunderstanding.
When they say to you, there's no such thing as right and wrong, therefore if you judge another culture, you're wrong.
Whoa, hold up. It essentially sounds to me like you're implying that atheism logically entails moral nihilism, which of course is not the case because atheism itself does not entail or imply any specific moral positioning. Where someone falls in regards to what human moral distinctions are is completely separate from whether or not they believe in a God concept. And this is evidenced by the fact that there are theists who are moral relativists and atheists who are moral realists. Speaking only for myself, I am a moral relativist, and I hold that objective morality, meaning mind-independent, is not a thing that exists. And while moral distinctions themselves are subjective to the individual, the subjective moral distinctions that a society agrees upon collectively are objectively true in virtue of the relationship those distinctions have to the goals agreed upon by the society. So I would not tell you that right and wrong simply don't exist. I would just tell you that the terms right and wrong describe those actions and outcomes that we humans subjectively accept or reject as informed by our capacity for empathy. And while some atheists may be moral nihilists, for you to use that fact to imply that atheism leads to moral nihilism is a non sequitur, and for you to use it to imply that it entails that all atheists are moral nihilists is a fallacy of composition.
Well, if there's no such thing as right or wrong, why shouldn't I judge another culture?
So you think that moral nihilists who claim that there is no such thing as right and wrong subsequently lose any justification to judge anyone else. And I get why you may think that, because how can they possibly say what is objectively right and wrong in any other culture if they themselves hold that such distinctions either don't exist or are inapplicable? But what you're missing here, Andrew, is that moral nihilism isn't just so much a position on the existence of objective or subjective moral distinctions. It's a position that such distinctions, in the grand scope of what moral nihilists interpret as an amoral universe, are simply mental conceptualizations that are social-centric and possess no concrete mind-independent referent, thus rendering that category as incoherent and non-existent. For them, human moral distinctions are nothing more than a social novelty that will cease to exist when our species inevitably goes extinct. But the real issue here, Andrew, is that you're not talking about atheism anymore. You're talking about moral nihilism and its rejection of any and all moral distinctions. So what you should have said is moral moral nihilists who present moral distinctions as though they are objective doesn't make any sense. And you would be correct, which is exactly why people who hold that philosophical position don't make those claims. What all this basically means is that you opened this entire thing with two flat-out lies. The first being about what atheism is and what it entails. The second being about moral nihilists and the claims they make.
You say, well, you have to respect every culture. Well, my culture is the culture that doesn't respect your culture. You have to respect my culture, not respecting your culture. They're not making any sense.
Again, Andrew, you're not articulating an argument against atheism. But all alliteration aside, I don't really care about your opinion on moral nihilism. I only care about the fact that you are capitalizing on the captive audience in front of you by lying to them.
They sit around and they say men and women are completely the same. The internal life of a man and the internal life of a woman, completely the same.
Okay, so if I'm tracking your, stream of consciousness here, you think that atheism entails moral nihilism, which it doesn't, that moral nihilism entails that moral statements made about others cannot be objective, which is not something that moral nihilists themselves are claiming, and that the various distinctions described in biology, sociology, and psychology regarding biological sex and gender identity are either directly informed by or are themselves also moral distinctions. Well, I hate to burst your bubble there, Drewski, but beyond the subjective moral distinction that an individual's identity ought to be respected by their society, because the evidence shows that if the goal of the society is to increase and maintain the well-being of all of its members, then social rejection of individual identity is something that works directly against the accomplishment of that goal. These two concepts are not related because moral nihilism is strictly concerned with moral distinctions, while biological sex and gender identity are concerns of the fields of biology, sociology, and psychology. If sex and gender distinctions were the same as moral distinctions, which they are not, then moral nihilists wouldn't be making any statements about them anyway because they would both occupy the same incoherent category. But ultimately, what got my attention with that statement, Andrew, was not what you said, but what you did not say. Sex distinctions are determined by biology and are backed by direct evidence, and as such are irrelevant to a moral argument. Gender distinctions, however, come down to statements that the individual is making about themselves. And as such, the only role that moral distinctions play into that are distinctions made by others as to accept or reject those self-identifying statements. So back in reality, Andrew, when you invoke the topic of trans identity in the context of a moral argument, you're not making statements about them, you're making statements about yourself. So up to this point in the video, Andrew, all you've really managed to do is invoke atheism and moral nihilism in some twisted effort to try and justify your own ignorant bigotry against the trans community.
And, I think, okay, I've lived a long time. That's not the way it looks to me. But, great, believe what you want.
No, I'll be believing what the biological, sociological, psychological, and statistical evidence shows.
But then they say, I'm a woman in a man's body.
What has that got to do with it?
It really is just weird to me that Andrew here thinks that shoehorning in the trans identity topic is a logically consistent move. But hey, I guess it wouldn't be an official Daily Wire video without some obligatory passive-aggressive transphobia. But what Andrew doesn't seem to realize is that all this little display has done is demonstrate his fundamental ignorance when it comes to philosophy, his cowardly bigotry when it comes to the trans community, and that it was incredibly easy to see that this entire presentation was never about conveying cogent ideas to the audience. It was only ever about invoking very specific buzzwords in order to emotionally manipulate an audience who he likely knows is too ignorant to pick up on it.
And you say, well, if there's no difference, how do you know?
Okay, so you, like your fellow Daily Wire cronies so often do, are conflating biological sex with gender identity. Unfortunately for you and your ilk, Andrew, it is a fact backed by mountains of evidence that biological sex does not determine gender identity.
It's not binary.
And your insinuation that recognizing the natural gender spectrum somehow implies the claim that biological males and females are indistinguishable from each other is both gross and harmful.
How do you know if men and women are exactly the same? What would it be like to be a woman in a man's body? It would just be like being a man in a man's body. They're just the same. They're not making any sense.
And you capped it all off with an attempt to imply that atheism logically entails holding false positions regarding the trans community.
You're really bad at this.
So we had a lie about what atheism is, a lie about what atheism entails, a lie about what moral nihilists do, a personal position, and physical demonstration about what philosophically ignorant people may do, some passive-aggressive bigotry, and another lie about atheism. I gotta say, Andrew, well done on completely wrecking yourself. It was such a display of truly ignorant arrogance that I think only a gratuitous use of the hard R and a live reenactment of a Serbian film could have made any worse. So let's move on to the next video, in which political commentator Michael Knowles is joined by Christian author Anthony DeStefano, and they opine like a Meet the Feebles version of Statler and Waldorf on whether or not atheism itself is a religion.
Atheists take so many things on faith. They believe that everything came from nothing.
And the Daily Wire lie machine just keeps on churning, doesn't it? Whether or not any particular atheist takes anything on faith is not the defeater you think it is, boys. When an atheist points out to you that believing in a god solely on faith is completely irrational, and you emotionally swing back at them as also holding faith positions in certain things, such as science, you're literally just conceding what the atheist is pointing out to you. That faith is not an epistemological tool and thus should not be used to try and determine truth. As for this atheist that's here responding to you, no, I don't hold anything on faith. And before you try to jump in and say, oh, yes you do, you have faith that your wife loves you, and you have faith that the sun will come up tomorrow, and you have faith that evolution is true, or whatever other lie comes up next in your apologetics deck, that's just you trying to conflate faith with confidence. The former being a purely emotions-based position, while the latter is based on evidence and predictive modeling. Also, neither atheists, nor cosmologists, nor anyone other than theists themselves are claiming that something came from nothing. You guys have seriously got to let that notion go, because all it does is make you look outwardly as terrible as I imagine you all are internally.
Well, you can't prove that scientifically.
Well, yeah, probably because it's not a scientific claim. It's a theological one. I can answer that. No, atheism is not a religion. And why it's not a religion should, to a reasonable person be fairly obvious. But let's see if the Daily Wire boys can figure that out.
Everybody's got to serve somebody.
My inclination is to say no to that, given that to serve or to supply services is defined as duties or work done towards the goal or goals of another person or group. And no one is required to serve anyone or anything ever in their life. Ultimately, who or what is served is who or what the individual chooses to serve. And that is the empowering beauty of it. You yourself get to choose who and what you serve, if anyone or anything at all. Now let's see how they try to twist this notion into atheism somehow being a religion.
And so the environmentalists have the original sin of pollution.
Wait, what?
Obviously, theological concepts like original sin and environmentalists focusing on addressing the real-world problem of pollution are in no way analogous. Pollution is a demonstrably real problem that was created by humans and affects everyone as it affects our environment. Unlike original sin, which in the non-theistic worldview is an abstract concept that exists only in the minds of the individuals who believe it, while in the theistic worldview it is entailed to be an imposition upon humanity as a result of their God deliberately creating the circumstances that allowed for it to be a logical possibility. In short, by your own lights, they are not analogous because the former is a choice and the latter was an imposition. I gotta tell you, man, hardcore stretches like this are a good way to hurt yourself, or at minimum, make yourself look like a totally disingenuous tool.
And they have the sacrament of, they sell indulgences in the form of those carbon tax credits, don't they?
Yep, totally disingenuous tool. How about, before you make yourself look any worse, we actually get to what you think makes atheism a religion?
There, in certain versions of intersectionality, there's the original sin of privilege.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're not done yet. Well, I guess just take as much time as you need.
There's actually the Gnostic metaphysics of transgenderism.
I often wonder what the odds would be if I made a predictive model concerning Daily Wire content and the presence of passive-aggressive bigotry.
100%.
You see all of these sorts of things crop up all of the time. Atheists, they pull away when you say that their religion is a faith.
Because it isn't a religion and there is no faith involved. Maybe you'd know this if you or any of your fellow chuds actually talked to an atheist, instead of misrepresenting us at every turn. You gotta admit, it's kinda weird when anti-gay people such as these go so utterly out of their way to look like giant assholes.
Oh my.
How can we convince them of this point?
You can't, because it's a complete falsehood. So the only way they would believe you is if they themselves were too ignorant to realize you were lying to them. But like I've said before, that's why I'm here.
Well, a faith is just believing something that you can't mathematically prove. That's all faith is.
Is he serious?
That's gotta be about the dumbest proprietary use of faith I've ever heard. I mean, I don't even think it's possible to infer that interpretation from what it says in the Bible. I swear, in all my time dealing with these subjects, I've seen a lot of theists strawmanning atheists, but it's not too often I get to see a theist strawman themselves in order to strawman atheists.
And atheists take so many things on faith. They believe that everything came from nothing.
Yeah, we don't. That's a purely theistic claim.
Well, you can't prove that scientifically. They believe that this amazing universe of ours of incomparable beauty, harmony, and order came about by itself.
So now you've contradicted yourself. Coming about by itself is not the same as coming from nothing. How is anyone supposed to take you seriously when you can't even keep your own position straight for 2 sentences? In my experience, the only people who screw up like this are people who are talking out of their ass, or people who are guilty of talking out of both sides of their mouth. Also, your appeal to what you personally feel about the universe is utterly irrelevant. Someone out there in the world could legitimately think that this universe was nothing more than a stagnant wasteland cesspool of meaningless death. And that wouldn't change the evidence and predictive models that serve to explain how our universe came about from a prior state of energy.
That's faith.
Yes, believing that a God exists and that it did all the creating is a faith position for you. Atheists looking at the evidence and accepting the conclusions based on the strength of predictive modeling is called confidence. These two things are not and never were the same, no matter how badly you want to try and drag atheists down to your level.
They're trapped into this whole materialist worldview where everything has to do with atoms and molecules.
Please, feel free to demonstrate that you have mind-independently verifiable access to anything other than the natural world. I'll wait.
You know, all our hopes and dreams and desires, all our art and culture and history, all our deepest desire for everything that's good and beautiful and true, all that to them is just due to the random movement of molecules. That's not science.
Technically it is, because it's addressing those things in the natural world, and it's not assuming the existence of anything outside of the natural world in order to justify any emotional positions. Your emotional appeal here is just an argument from consequences, that you don't personally like what's entailed by the logical possibility of the universe strictly being matter in motion, and the non-existence of the supernatural is not a defeater, and only further demonstrates how atheism is not a religion. You just can't stop contradicting yourself, can you?
That's faith. What's more, that's an irrational faith that's the basis for all superstition.
I gotta say, it's not often you hear someone claim that people who put evidence over emotions are the ones being irrational. But back here in reality, it's probably the most irrational thing you could have done, claiming that atheists are irrational because they don't feel the same way about things as you do. Could you be more narcissistic?
So they have a faith. They must be called out on this point, because this faith that they have has been responsible for more bloodshed and carnage than any system of beliefs the world has ever known.
The one good thing about lies as blatant as that one is that they so quickly collapse under their own weight that I don't have to waste any of your time debunking them. And we're going to go ahead and skip this last little section because it's just Tweedledee on the right over there grotesquely doubling down on his previous lie. And they never once point out exactly how atheism is a religion. But then again, it's not like we really expected them to. Last up, and most certainly worst, we have that personification of Plato's cave if it were filled chest high with human feces, Matt Walsh. And in this one, Matt does the Cartheist thing, where he waxes philosophically in front of the camera about whether or not atheists can be moral people.
Now, yesterday I made the argument that there is no basis for objective morality without God.
Just because you asserted that with all the machismo of a frat bro 6 years into a bachelor's doesn't make it true. Now, if you actually understood what the difference is between subjective, meaning mind-dependent, and objective, meaning mind-independent, you'd know that if a mind, which is what you define your God as, is making the distinctions between what is moral and immoral, and the only referent for those distinctions is itself, then not only are those distinctions completely arbitrary, but they are also definitionally subjective, meaning that they are dependent upon the God's mind. Were there a mind-independent referent for what moral distinctions should be, then those distinctions would never, in any possible world, be otherwise. Which means that even a God actualizing any logically possible system would necessarily have to reference that source for any moral distinctions it made to be objective. But by your own lights, Matt, your God necessarily pre-exists the not God set, and as such would not be able to make distinctions between what is good and bad or moral and immoral, as neither one of those things exists to give the other a reference for coherency. Following this line of reasoning, if you take your worldview to its logical conclusion, your God winds up being reduced to a mere function. No agency, no will, no desire, no plan. It simply does what it does because it cannot do otherwise. What this also entails is that it is in fact you who is backmapping your subjective moral distinctions onto the God character in an attempt to provide your own subjective moral inclinations and intuitions and objective grounding. For example, Matt, I suspect that you have a deep-seated ignorant fear of trans people and thus react poorly when they make your bottom tingle. So you then project your intolerance onto the God character so that you can feel like your shameless bigotry is justified. And by the by, it is completely okay if there is no source for objective moral distinctions. Once again, if the only reason you reject moral relativism is because you do not like what is entailed by it, that is not a defeater. It's just an argument from consequences.
As an atheist, you cannot logically assert any kind of objective moral code because you have denied God.
Well, that would hold for anyone, atheist or theist, who is a moral realist, as there is no mind-independent source for moral distinctions. But as I stated before, I'm a moral relativist, so I hold that all of these distinctions and valuations are entirely subjective. So this really doesn't apply to me. And try to keep in mind, Matt, because it's not like I haven't repeated myself 1,000 times before, atheism itself does not logically entail any position on morality. So, like the idiots who lied their asses off before you, your issue is not with atheism, it's with moral relativism.
And I argued that the only thing left for an atheist is moral relativism. That's really the only option that is logically open to them.
See, you're on the right track there, Matt. The issue here is asserting that there is a mind-independent source for moral distinctions. Now, if only you could understand that that is decidedly not what your God is.
Now, I'm not going to rehash that argument. You can go and listen to it or watch it if you like. My main objective was just to knock down the idea that it's possible for objective morality to exist in a godless universe.
It doesn't exist in a theistic world either. You may call it that, but that either means that you're completely ignorant of what objective means, or you're just plain lying to your audience about it.
I'll let you be the judge of that.
And now what I'd like to do is I'd like to engage what appeared to be the two most frequent criticisms of the position that I expressed yesterday.
If one of them is not that you're using the term objective incorrectly, then either your usual audience is as ignorant as you are, or you're just making up all this shit as you go along.
Now, the first one, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. I did want to mention it, though. There were a lot of people who insisted quite breathlessly that it is possible for an atheist to do good things and be a good person.
Well, sure they can. Those distinctions would be subjectively determined by the agents around them, as they are informed by their capacity for empathy and their own subjective moral intuitions, and the agreed-upon goals of the society in which they live, which are something that moral distinctions can be objectively true in virtue of.
In fact, as I was told, just because atheists believe that there is no God doesn't mean that they're going to go off killing and raping, etc.
While true, atheism doesn't entail that the atheist is a psychopath, it's also irrelevant to the question at hand, because the topic here is you claiming that there is a source for objective moral distinctions, and not what those distinctions necessarily are.
You don't need God to be a good person, I was told.
Also true.
And to that argument, I say, yes. Also, what are you responding to, and who are you responding to?
That individual is responding to the notion that moral relativism is sufficient for determining what is right and wrong or good and bad. Yes, those distinctions are themselves subjective, but as I've stated before, they can be objectively true in virtue of their relationship to the goals of the society. So yeah, a person doesn't need a God to be what we would typically agree is a good person. In fact, I'd argue that if you actually believe a God and thus a promise of heaven or a threat of hell is required for someone to be a good person, then I would invite you to take some much needed time off and maybe do a hard re-examination of what that says about your own character.
Of course atheists can be moral. Of course atheists can do good things. I never argued to the contrary.
Okay, so then what's the issue here?
I didn't argue that atheists can't be good people. I said that atheism provides no rational basis for asserting goodness and badness as objective realities.
Technically, you are correct, because that's not what atheism is, and it's not what atheism entails. So, just as if you were to point at, say, the elliptical orbit of Pluto and then claim that it has nothing to do with how funny the platypus looks, your argument is a total nothing burger. Because literally no one is claiming that atheism does what you think other people are claiming that it does.
That's all. That was my argument. I'm not sure why so many atheists struggle to understand this distinction, and it's kind of funny to me that atheists like to impugn the intelligence of believers.
Well, to be frank, y'all's Dunning-Kruger makes it really, really easy, and your reactions are always prime cringe entertainment.
While at the same time, with the whole invisible sky daddy and all that kind of nonsense.
As much as you don't like that reductive description, it's not really nonsense, because it is describing exactly what you believe in. If you don't want people making fun of you for believing silly shit, either keep it to yourself or get educated and realize you should have dropped the belief 20 years ago.
While at the same time, which again, there is no Christian above the age of 5 who actually believes that God is in the sky, or that he's magical.
Your worldview literally claims that your God resides in the heavens above, which qualifies as the sky, and that it actualized everything in the not God set out of nothingness. That's magic. God magic, to be specific. But you seem to be getting lost in the weeds of your persecution complex, Matt. How about we try getting things back on track?
So, it's another, it's a
Spit that shit out, man!
kind of really stupid straw man.
Are those descriptions reductive? Yes. Are they a straw man? Not in any sense of the word.
That I see that intelligent atheists will use.
The very fact that you're calling silly reductive descriptions of your God a straw man indicates to me that you are likely not the best judge for what is and is not intelligent. But setting all that aside, everything you're talking about here is irrelevant to the topic at hand. I honestly thought you were going to explain to us how exactly a mind that references nothing because nothing exists external of itself to reference is somehow simultaneously a mind-independent source. Or was this whole thing just an excuse for you to sit in your car and whine about how persecuted you feel because people make fun of your God?
And it's beneath them to get into that kind of stuff.
Well, if they were getting into it, then they weren't smart atheists. Perhaps if you took it upon yourself to engage with more educated atheists, you'd probably find the answers you were asking for. Unless, of course, your common choice of interlocutor is deliberate.
But they do it. And even here, even among intelligent atheists, there appears to be this inability to understand a really basic distinction and nuance.
No, I get what you're saying. That's how I know that all of this is irrelevant to the topic at hand.
So, again, I'm not saying that atheists aren't good. I'm saying that atheism itself, the belief system, provides no rational basis for asserting the objective nature of morality.
And no one is claiming it is, Matt. And seeing as how that's the end of your little car therapy session, and you never explained how a mind that references nothing itself to make distinctions can somehow simultaneously be a mind-independent reference for the distinctions that it's making, your entire Cartheist rant was, like the rest of your body of work, completely pointless. And that's going to conclude this look at the talking heads over at the Daily Wire, yapping about shit they either do not fully understand, or they do fully understand it, and this is all just rage-baiting, ad revenue generating performance art. Now, to bridge the divide here, it's obviously important that before you engage in critiques of other worldviews, that you possess a full understanding of not only the worldview you're critiquing, but also your own. Possessing that understanding will give you the tools you need to recognize when the other person is making ignorant false assumptions or attempting to gaslight you. Knowing how to avoid those traps is a great way to ensure that the conversation can remain productive, and both parties can come away having built some middle ground from which further progress can be made, instead of just burning bridges so that we can remain safe in our echo chambers. Intellectual honesty is the key to these exchanges, and is the only way that we can actually move forward and begin to address the problems that we collectively face as a species. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, December is HIV/AIDS Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you saw here and would like to support me further, links to channel membership and to get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear is down in the description as well. Once again, a massive thank you to each and every single one of you for your continued support, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.